Alarms first, then light. My console turned red before my brain caught up with why. 500 contacts. Not drifting in. Not creeping. Dropping out of the black all at once, like someone had punched a hole in the sky and poured a war through it. I was 3 hours into a patrol nobody thought would matter. Coffee gone cold in the cup holder. Boots up on the console, which Grant always told me was against regulation, and which I always ignored because Grant wasn't the one flying this thing. Then the sensor board lit up like a Christmas tree that hated me personally, and my boots came down fast. "Talk to me," I said. Priya's voice cracked through the comm, tight and fast. 500 ships, Commander. Formation type unknown. They're not ours. They're not anybody's. Define not anybody's. I mean, nobody human built that. I looked up through the canopy and saw them for myself. Ships stacked in tiers, gold and black, arranged the way a chess player arranges pieces when they already know they've won. Big, confident. The kind of big that isn't about firepower so much as it's about making sure you feel small before the first shot ever fires. I felt something. It wasn't fear. It was closer to recognizing a face you hoped you'd never see again. "Command, this is Vasquez," I said. "I've got eyes on an unregistered fleet at the belt marker. Recommend you look at this before you finish your coffee." There was a pause. Not panic. Just the ordinary 2-second delay of someone reading a report. "Copy, Reaper," Command said. "We see them." That was it. No scramble order. No fleet mobilization horn. Just a voice as calm as a man, telling you the mail had arrived. I stared at the display like it had personally insulted me. "You see them," I repeated. 500 ships just parked themselves off our front porch, and Sol Command's response is, "We see them? Hold position, Reaper. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." Grant's voice came in over the second channel, quieter, the way he always got right before something. "Elena, you seeing the formation? I've got 2 eyes and a bad feeling. Yeah, that's not a scouting formation. That's a first contact package. Diplomatic escort, weapons hot. Standard opening posture for a species that's done this before." "Done what before?" "This," Grant said. "All of it. Somebody's about to give us a very polite speech about how things are going to be now." He wasn't wrong. The largest of the 500 ships lit up with a transmission request. Not a request, really. A demand dressed up as one. The kind that assumes you'll say yes because saying no has never once worked out for anybody who tried. Command patched it through fleet-wide. I didn't ask them to. I think they wanted everyone to hear it. I think, looking back, they wanted every single person in the Sol system to know exactly what was said, word for word, so that later, and there would be a later, nobody could pretend it had been a misunderstanding. The voice that came through was smooth in the way oil is smooth. Not warm, just frictionless. "Inhabitants of this system, you have been located by the Sovereign Compact of the Threshold Empire. Your world has been assessed and classified as viable for resource integration. You will submit your planetary command structure for administrative transfer within 1 solar rotation. Resistance will be interpreted as forfeiture of population rights. Compliance ensures continued biological function for a percentage of your species deemed useful." Silence on my end of the comm. Real silence. The kind that has weight. Then I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just came out of me. Short and ugly. The kind of laugh you laugh at a funeral when the grief gets so big it flips over into something else entirely. "Vasquez," Grant said, "you wanna maybe not do that on an open channel." They said resource integration, Grant. They said percentage deemed useful. Do they know where they are? I don't think they do. Do we? He didn't answer that one. He didn't have to. I watched the enemy formation hold steady, patient, confident, arranged in the shape of a threat that had clearly worked on somebody before us. Maybe a lot of somebodies. Enough somebodies that this had become routine for them. A script, a form letter, 500 ships wide, sent to every world unlucky enough to be worth taking. My hands were steady on the controls. That surprised me a little. I expected them to shake. They didn't shake. They'd stopped shaking a long time ago, about a decade before I ever put on this uniform, back when shaking hands didn't help with anything, and steady ones sometimes did. I keyed the comm again. "Command, this is Vasquez. Orders? Maintain position. Do not fire unless fired upon. And if they fire? A different voice answered that one. Older. I recognized it. Fleet Admiral Okafor, a woman who did not waste words on people who already knew the answer. Then you'll see something you've never seen before, Commander. Hold your position and watch. That was the whole order. Hold your position and watch. I looked over at Priya's feed, at the enemy fleet sitting there in that smug golden formation, 500 ships deep, utterly certain of what came next. They had made a script for first contact, a form letter for conquest. Percentage deemed useful, they'd said, like we were livestock being sorted at auction. I thought about my father's photograph clipped to the edge of my console, cracked down the middle from a fall it took 11 years ago, and I did not know yet why that particular memory picked that particular moment to surface. It just did. It sat there in my chest, like a stone dropped into still water, and I let it sit, because there wasn't time to do anything else with it. Grant's voice again, low. You feel that? Feel what? Like we've been waiting for this. I didn't answer him right away. I watched the enemy flagship hang there against the dark, so sure of itself, so confident in a script it had probably used 100 times on 100 worlds, that had never once fought back the way this one was about to. 80 years, I finally said, give or take. 80 years since what? Since we finished the last one, ours, and started building something so we'd never have to fight another one on our own soil again. Grant went quiet on the other end. Outside my canopy, the Threshold Empire's fleet began to move, slow and deliberate, spreading their formation wide the way you'd spread a net. Somewhere behind me, past the belt, past the orbit of Mars, past every line on every star chart that used to mean safety, Earth sat quiet and blue and utterly unbothered, the way it always looked from up here. They had no idea. Not one ship in that entire golden formation had the faintest idea what waiting on the other end of that patience actually was. I keyed my mic one last time before command cut the channel for good. Copy that, I said. And also, no. Then I put my hands back on the controls, and I watched, exactly like I'd been told to, as the nightmare that was about to become theirs, finally, quietly, began. The first shot came 11 minutes later. Not at us, at the moon. One of the Threshold ships, a smaller one, broke formation and put a single beam of white-hot light straight at Luna. Not a warning shot in the sense of missing on purpose, a warning shot in the sense of hitting something big enough that the message would be unmistakable. Watch what we can do to a piece of rock. Now imagine your cities. I watched it happen in real time, the beam crossing the dark in a straight, arrogant line, and some part of me went cold and still, waiting for the flash, waiting for the moon I'd grown up looking at from a dirt road in Texas to come apart at the edges. It didn't. The beam reached Luna's orbit and simply stopped mattering. No explosion, no shockwave, no crater blooming pale against the gray surface. The light just folded in on itself, 300 kilometers short of the target, like it had walked into a wall nobody could see. Luna sat there afterward exactly the way it always had, gray, pockmarked, unbothered, a rock that had been getting hit by things far worse than a threshold energy weapon since before there were people around to name it. Priya's voice came through, thinner than before. Commander, did you see that? I saw it. What stopped it? I don't know. That was the truth, and it unsettled me more than a lie would have. I'd trained 12 years in this fleet. I'd sat through briefings on defense grids, shield technology, orbital countermeasures, every system Earth had ever built to keep itself safe. Nothing in any of those briefings looked like what I'd just watched. No visible emitter, no flare of energy meeting energy. Just a beam that traveled exactly as far as it was allowed to, and then simply ceased. Grant's voice, quieter now, almost reverent in a way I didn't like from him. That's not a shield. Then what is it? I think it's a decision. I didn't have time to ask him what he meant, because the Threshold fleet was already reacting, ships shifting position, sensor arrays spinning to reacquire whatever had just eaten their opening shot without so much as a flinch. Their formation, so patient and confident 20 minutes earlier, tightened. Ships that had been spread wide in that net shape pulled closer together, The universal body language of something that has just realized it might not be standing where it thinks it's standing. Command, I said. Orders. Hold, Reaper. They just tested a weapon on our moon. And it did nothing. Hold position. I held. It was the hardest order I'd ever followed, sitting there with my hands wrapped around controls I wasn't allowed to use, watching an alien fleet regroup after failing to crack open a piece of rock that had survived 4 billion years of far worse. Every instinct built into me by training told me to move, to close distance, to do something. Every order told me to sit still and watch. So I watched. The Threshold flagship issued a new transmission, shorter this time, less smooth. The oil slick comm from the first broadcast had a crack in it now, a thin one, but I could hear it. Your defensive technology is noted, and will be factored into revised terms. Further resistance will result in immediate escalation. Escalation, Grant repeated, flat. They're threatening escalation after failing to dent a moon. Maybe they don't know it failed. They know. He was right. Their sensor readings would have told them exactly what I was seeing. A beam that simply stopped. No damage, no feedback, nothing. What followed was worse, in a way, because it was slower. The Threshold fleet didn't retreat, and it didn't advance. It sat there recalculating, and I understood, watching them do it, that we were witnessing something rare, a conquering force encountering, for possibly the first time in its long and successful history, a target it did not know how to categorize. 20 ships broke from the main formation and began a wide flanking maneuver toward the outer patrol line, where 3 other Earth Defense Fleet vessels were stationed. I recognized the call signs on my display. Cole in the Meridian. Anand, no relation to Priya, different family, same steady nerve, in the Halloway. A newer captain named Owen Faraday in a Corvette that had barely finished its shakedown cruise. Command, they're moving on the patrol line, I said. We see it, Reaper. Hold. 3 ships against 20, and you want us to hold? Hold, Commander. That is not a request. I gripped the controls hard enough that my knuckles went pale, and I held, because that was the job, and because some cold, steady part of me, that I didn't fully trust yet, was already telling me this wasn't going to go the way the Threshold Empire expected. The 20 ships opened fire on the patrol line in a coordinated volley, dozens of weapon signatures all lighting up my sensor board at once. A wall of firepower aimed at 3 human vessels that, by every measure I understood, should not have survived the first 3 seconds of that exchange. Cole's voice came through, and it was the strangest thing I'd ever heard in a combat situation. It wasn't panic. It was almost bored. Taking fire, he said, like he was reporting the weather. No damage sustained. Returning fire is not authorized. Repeat, no damage sustained. I stared at the display. 20 ships, full volley, no damage. The Threshold weapons crossed the distance, exactly the way the moonshot had, and exactly the way the moonshot had. They simply stopped mattering somewhere short of their target, the light and heat and force of them folding into nothing against a barrier none of our own sensors could even properly locate. And then, one at a time, without a single shot fired back at them that I could see, the 20 attacking ships began to fail. Not explode. Fail. Their weapon signatures dropped off my board first, one after another, the way lights go out in a building when someone starts flipping breakers, room by room. Then their propulsion. Then, ship by ship, their power cores, until entire vessels sat dead in space, drifting on inertia alone, dark against the stars, exactly where they'd been a moment before, except now, they weren't anything but wreckage, waiting for gravity to decide what came next. Nobody on my side had fired a shot. Priya, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Confirm. Did anyone in the patrol line engage? Negative, Commander. Weapons cold across all 3 ships, confirmed by their own telemetry. They didn't do this. Then who did? Nobody answered that. Nobody could. I sat there watching 20 enemy warships go dark in the space of 90 seconds. No visible cause. No flash of friendly fire. No missile trails, nothing but a slow, silent, systematic unmaking that felt less like a battle and more like a verdict being handed down. Grant's voice, when it finally came, had lost every trace of the reverence from before. What replaced it was something closer to dread. Elena, he said, I don't think that was us. I don't think that was the fleet. Then what was it? I think it's older than the fleet. I didn't understand him yet. I would, soon enough, but in that moment, all I had was the sight in front of me. 20 dead ships tumbling slow through the dark, and 480 more sitting motionless in formation, no longer patient, no longer confident, radiating something through their sensor emissions that even I, with no training in reading alien body language, could recognize without translation. They were afraid. The flagship transmitted again, and this time there was no smoothness left in the voice at all. Identify your weapon system. Identify your weapon system immediately. Nobody answered them. Command didn't authorize a response, and honestly, I don't think anyone on our side actually had an answer to give. I watched the Threshold Admiral's flagship hold position while smaller vessels darted around the drifting wrecks of the 20 dead ships, scanning, probing, looking for the thing that had killed them, and finding, as far as I could tell from their increasingly frantic sensor sweeps, absolutely nothing. Because there was nothing to find, not in the way they were looking for it. Grant came back on the comm, quieter now, almost like he didn't want to say it out loud even though we were the only two on the channel. You remember the old stories, he said, the ones from before either of us were born, about what Earth built after the last war, the stuff nobody talks about in public briefings. I've heard rumors. They're not rumors. I felt that stone in my chest again, the one shaped like my father's cracked photograph, and I did not ask Grant to explain further, because some part of me, the part that had grown up on stories half told by people who never finished them, already understood that I was about to learn exactly what kind of world I'd been born into. Command's voice cut through the channel again, calm, unbothered, almost gentle. All patrol vessels, maintain position. Do not engage. Let them come to a decision. What decision? I asked, though I already suspected I wasn't going to like the answer. The only one left to them, Okafor said. Surrender, or discover exactly how patient we've been. The Threshold fleet held its position for 11 long minutes, their formation trembling with a stillness that read, even across the gulf of space, and the gap between two entirely different forms of life, as something close to terror. Then their flagship's engines flared, bright and sudden, and the entire remaining fleet began to move, not toward us, and not away, toward Earth. I felt my stomach drop. Command, I said, sharper now than I meant to be. They're advancing on the planet. We see it, Reaper. They're going straight for the population centers. We see it, Commander. Hold your position. With respect, ma'am, that's a lot of ships heading towards 6 billion people, and you're telling me to hold. There was a pause on the line, short, and when Okafor spoke again, her voice hadn't changed at all. Still even, still unbothered, still carrying that same terrible calm I was starting to understand wasn't calm at all. It was certainty. Commander Vasquez, she said, I need you to trust that we have been ready for this exact moment for longer than you have been alive. Hold your position, and watch. So I held. And I watched 480 ships, the last of what had arrived that morning, full of confidence and form letters, and a script that had clearly worked on every world unlucky enough to meet them before this one, turn their bows toward a planet that had spent 80 quiet years building something none of them had ever imagined they'd need to survive. Something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel. Weather change before the sky admits it. A pressure behind the eyes. A stillness in my own hands that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instinct, passed down from somewhere older than either. Grant's voice, one last time before the silence took over the channel entirely. Elena, he said, whatever happens next, this is the part they don't teach in the history classes. Why not? Because nobody who lived through it wanted it written down. I didn't ask him what he meant by that. I would find out soon enough, in a way that no briefing, no training exercise, and no half-finished bedtime story from my father could have prepared me for. The Threshold fleet crossed the last of the distance toward Earth's outer defense line, and the planet I had grown up on, the one that still looked from up here exactly the way it always had, blue and quiet and utterly unbothered, finally, after 80 years of patient and terrible waiting, opened its eyes. I need you to understand something about where I come from, because it matters for what happened next, and because nobody outside that room ever explains it properly. I grew up outside a small town in West Texas, in a house my grandmother built with her own hands, after the world stopped making sense for a while. She didn't talk about the years before I was born. Almost nobody from that generation did. There was a stretch of history, roughly 200 years, that people my age learned about in school, as a series of dates and casualty numbers, flattened down into paragraphs that were somehow both horrifying and completely forgettable, because numbers that large stop feeling like people and start feeling like weather. 2 centuries of war, not against anyone from the stars, against each other. I won't walk through all of it, because most of it isn't mine to walk through, and because some of it isn't meant to be explained, only carried. But there's one line from a school textbook that stuck with me, the way certain lines do, the ones that land somewhere below language, and just sit there for the rest of your life. The Kessler line. That's all it said in my 7th grade history book. The Kessler line, 1 paragraph, a date, a number so large it had stopped being a number and become something closer to a wall you weren't allowed to look directly at. I asked my teacher what it meant. She told me to ask my parents. My father, when I finally asked him years later, sitting on the porch of that same house my grandmother built, took a long time to answer, and when he did, all he said was this: "That's the day the ocean stopped being blue where I was standing." He never explained further. I never asked him to. Some things you learn not to pull on, because the thread doesn't lead somewhere you actually want to go, and because the not knowing, strange as it sounds, is sometimes its own kind of mercy. What I understood, piecing it together over years from things half said and silences that weighed more than words, was this: humanity had come close to erasing itself, not once, multiple times, across 2 centuries, in wars that started over things that seem almost absurd in hindsight: borders, ideology, resources, pride, and escalated, each time, past the point where anyone involved could remember what they were originally fighting for. Weapons were built in those wars that nobody speaks of by name anymore, not because they're classified, but because naming them makes them real again, and there's a kind of collective agreement, unspoken, generational, that some things are better left as shapes in the dark than words in the light. 11 billion people. That's the number nobody says out loud, but it's the number that sits underneath every quiet, careful thing my generation was taught about restraint, about proportion, about the terrible weight of what happens when a species with that kind of power stops being careful with it. We didn't come out the other side of those centuries as a species that forgot how to build weapons. We came out as a species that understood, with a clarity most other things in the galaxy apparently never develop, exactly what those weapons cost, and exactly what it looked like when they were used without restraint. So when Earth finally stopped fighting itself, when the wars ended not in triumph but in exhaustion so total it functioned as its own kind of peace, humanity did something almost nobody expects a species to do after nearly destroying itself. We kept building. Not because we wanted another war, because we understood, with the bone-deep certainty of people who had survived their own worst instincts, that something else was out there, and that the galaxy does not reward the unprepared with mercy. 80 years of quiet construction followed. 80 years of a species that had learned, the hardest way imaginable, exactly what it meant to hold power, and choose, deliberately, again and again, not to use it against itself. That restraint became a kind of architecture. It shaped everything Earth built after the wars ended. Defense systems designed not around aggression, but around absolute, overwhelming certainty. Engineered by people who had personally watched what happened when certainty wasn't absolute enough. Weapons that didn't announce themselves with visible fire, because the generation that built them had grown up watching visible fire consume everything they loved, and they wanted no part of theater. They wanted only the ending, delivered as quietly and completely as possible. That was what the Threshold Empire had walked into. Not a young species flush with confidence and unprepared for consequence. Not a first contact scenario where diplomacy might still carry the day, where a show of force might still frighten a fragile world into compliance. They had walked into a species that had already fought the worst war it was capable of fighting, against itself, and had spent 80 years afterward making absolutely certain it would never have to fight one it might lose. I learned most of this not from a briefing, but from Grant, over the comm, in the minutes after the Threshold fleet turned toward Earth, his voice low and steady, in a way that told me he'd known this his whole career, and simply never had cause to say it out loud before. My grandfather worked on the outer defense grid, he said, back before either of us were born. He never talked about the specifics, just told me once, when I was a kid, that Earth doesn't lose wars anymore, not because we're the strongest, because we're the ones who learned, the hard way, exactly what losing actually costs, and decided we would rather be feared than mourned again.
Feared by who?
Anybody dumb enough to try. I looked at my display, at the Threshold fleet closing the last of the distance toward Earth's outer defense line, 480 ships strong, moving with a confidence that had cracked but not yet broken, and I understood, watching them, that they were about to learn something no diplomatic briefing could have prepared them for. They thought they were invading a young world. They were actually walking into the aftermath of an old one. The Threshold fleet's scouts reached the edge of Earth's defense perimeter first, small fast vessels sent ahead to probe for weaknesses, the way you'd send a hand into water to check the temperature, before committing the rest of your body. I watched their sensor sweeps ripple out across our formation, searching for weapon platforms, shield generators, anything that might explain what had happened to their 20 dead ships at the belt. They found nothing, because there was, in the way they were looking for it, nothing to find. What Earth had built in those 80 quiet years wasn't a wall you could locate on a sensor array. It wasn't a shield generator with a power signature to trace, or a weapon platform with a firing solution to calculate. It was something closer to a decision, distributed and layered and woven so thoroughly into the space around the planet that trying to find its source was like trying to find the exact point where a held breath becomes a held breath. There wasn't a point. There was only the whole of it, everywhere at once, patient and total. The scouts reported back to the flagship. I couldn't hear their transmission, but I could see the response in how the main fleet's formation shifted afterward, tighter, more cautious, ships repositioning in patterns that read, even to my untrained eye, as the body language of something that had just been told there was nowhere left to run, and had not yet decided how to feel about it.
"They're stalling," Priya said. "Formation's not advancing anymore. They've stopped." "Command," I said. "Enemy fleet has halted approximately 40,000 kilometers from the outer line. We see it, Reaper. They're scared. They should be. They should be."
I turned that thought over for a while, sitting there in the quiet hum of my cockpit, watching a fleet that had arrived that morning with a form letter about resource integration and percentage deemed useful, now hang motionless in the dark, clearly recalculating everything it thought it knew about the world in front of it. Somewhere behind that fear, I imagined, was the same slow, dawning horror my father must have felt as a young man, standing somewhere the ocean used to be blue, watching the horizon change color in a way that no science lesson had ever prepared him for. The difference was, my father had lived through the making of that horror. The Threshold Empire was about to live through the other end of it. Their flagship transmitted one final message before the silence took over completely, and this time there was no smoothness left at all, no oil-slick confidence, nothing but the raw, unpolished sound of something that had finally understood exactly how badly it had misjudged its target. "This world is not compliant with initial assessment parameters," the voice said, and it was shaking now, actually shaking, a machine translation struggling to keep pace with whatever genuine emotion was driving the words underneath it. "Requesting reassessment. Requesting." The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Not because we jammed it, not because anyone gave an order to silence it. It cut off because, at that exact moment, without a single visible shot fired from anywhere I could locate on my sensor board, the Threshold flagship's forward third simply stopped existing, the way a word stops existing, the instant you decide not to finish saying it. No explosion, no debris field expanding outward the way explosions usually left one, just an absence, where a section of hull used to be, clean-edged and total, like reality itself had reached out and quietly erased exactly what it needed to erase, and nothing more. I stared at the wreckage of what had, 90 seconds earlier, been the most confident ship in a fleet of 500, and I understood, finally and completely, exactly what Grant had meant when he said this wasn't the fleet's doing. This was Earth's answer. 80 years, deployed in 90 seconds, against a fleet that had walked in expecting a conversation and instead found itself standing at the edge of something far older, far quieter, and far more absolute than anything their form letters had ever prepared them to survive. What happened after the flagship's forward section vanished can only be described as a fleet remembering, all at once, that it was made of individual people who wanted to survive. The remaining ships broke formation, not in the organized way a formation breaks when a commander gives an order. In the scattered, desperate way, a formation breaks when 479 crews independently decide, within the same handful of seconds, that whatever chain of command had gotten them here was no longer worth obeying. "They're retreating," Priya said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice, like she couldn't quite believe she got to say a word that hopeful. "Command, enemy fleet is breaking and attempting retreat," I said. Okafor's voice came back, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I heard something in it that wasn't calm. It wasn't excitement either. It was closer to grief, old and folded small, tucked underneath duty the way you tuck a photograph into a jacket pocket before a long shift. "Let them try," she said. "Hold position, all vessels. You do not pursue. Ma'am, if they're retreating, they're not going to make it far enough for pursuit to matter, Commander. Hold your position." She was right. I watched it happen the way you watch weather roll across open country back home, slow at first and then all at once, thunderheads swallowing blue sky whole. Ships at the rear of the retreating formation began to fail first, the same silent unmaking I'd watched happen to the 20 scouts at the belt, except now scaled up across hundreds of vessels simultaneously. Weapon signatures dropping off my board, propulsion dying, power cores going dark, one after another, in a wave that moved through the fleet, with a rhythm that felt less like violence and more like something being carefully, deliberately, unhurriedly finished. I want to tell you I felt triumphant watching it. I want to tell you there was some part of me that wanted to cheer, the way you're supposed to cheer when the enemy fleet that threatened your homeworld gets taken apart in front of you. I didn't feel that. What I felt instead was the stone in my chest again, the one shaped like my father's cracked photograph. And this time it didn't just sit there. It pressed. I looked at the photo clipped to the edge of my console. Small thing, faded at the corners. A crack running diagonal across the glass from a fall it took years ago that I never bothered to fix, because fixing it felt like admitting the crack mattered, and I didn't want to give it that. My father, 26 years old in that photograph, standing on a shoreline that doesn't exist anymore, in a country that doesn't exist anymore, under a sky that in the photo is still, somehow, ordinary blue. He never told me what happened to him during those years, not the specifics. Just that one line about the ocean, delivered once, on a porch, and never repeated. I used to think that meant he'd made peace with it. Watching 479 ships die in near total silence, in the space above my home planet, I understood, with a clarity that arrived uninvited and unwelcome, that he had never made peace with it at all. He had simply learned how to carry it without letting anyone see the weight. I didn't cheer. My crew didn't cheer. Across the comm channel, in the wake of the fleet's collapse, there was a silence that felt less like victory and more like a held breath, finally, carefully, being let out. "Priya," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I wanted it to. "Status on our own weapons. Cold across the board, Commander. We haven't fired a single shot. I know. I want to keep it that way. Copy that." I gave the order to power down our offensive systems entirely before command even asked, and nobody on my crew questioned it. Grant, on the other channel, didn't say anything for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had the particular quiet of someone who understood exactly why I'd given that order, without needing it explained. "You good?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I will be." He didn't push. That's one of the things I've always respected about Grant. He knows which doors not to knock on. I watched the last of the threshold formation go dark, ship by ship, until what had arrived that morning, as a confident fleet of 500, complete with form letters and percentage deemed useful, had become a debris field, drifting slow and silent, above a planet that had never once needed to raise its own hand to stop them. Not every ship died. That surprised me, and I think it surprised Command too, based on the pause that followed before new orders came through. Roughly 40 vessels remained functional, drifting. Weapons and propulsion offline but life support intact, crews alive inside them, waiting for whatever came next with the particular stillness of people who have run out of options and know it. Command, I said. We've got survivors, multiple vessels, life support active, no offensive capability remaining. There was a pause. Understood, Reaper. Hold position. Recovery teams are being dispatched. Recovery, I repeated. Not destruction. We're not in the business of finishing what doesn't need finishing, Commander, Okafor said, and something in the way she said it told me this wasn't policy invented in the moment. This was something decided a long time ago, by people who understood exactly what it costs to be the side that goes further than necessary, and had chosen, deliberately, not to be that side ever again. I sat there for a long while, watching the wreckage drift, watching the surviving threshold ships hang dark and quiet in the space where their entire invasion force used to be, and I thought about the 20 scouts at the belt, and the 479 that followed, and the fact that from start to finish, this entire war, if it could even be called that, had lasted just under 2 hours. 2 hours, against a fleet that had, by every indication in their opening transmission, conquered enough worlds to consider first contact a routine administrative procedure. I thought about the crews in those 40 surviving ships. I wondered if they had families. I wondered if somewhere, on whatever world the Threshold Empire called home, there were children waiting for parents who had left that morning, expecting an easy assignment, and were now sitting dark and powerless above a planet that could have erased every one of them, and chose, instead, to let them live. I didn't cheer, because I understood, sitting there in the quiet aftermath, exactly what kind of restraint that choice represented, and exactly what it must have cost the people who built the systems capable of making it. You don't develop that kind of careful, deliberate mercy by accident. You develop it the way my father developed his silence, by living through the alternative first, and promising yourself afterward that you would never again be the reason someone else had to carry a memory like his. Grant's voice came through one more time, before Command called for stand down across the fleet. Elena, he said, you did good today. I didn't do anything. I held position and watched, exactly like I was told. That's what good looked like today. I didn't have an answer for that. I just sat there, hands finally still on controls I hadn't needed to touch, watching Earth turn slow and blue and unbothered below me, the way it always had, the way it always would, protected not by the ship I was flying, but by 80 years of quiet, careful, terrible preparation, built by people who had already learned, at unbearable cost, exactly what happens when a species stops being careful with what it's capable of. I reached out and touched the crack in my father's photograph, the one I'd never bothered to fix. I still didn't fix it, but for the first time, I understood why he'd never fixed it either. Some things you don't repair, you just learn to carry them steady, and keep flying anyway. Recovery took 6 days. I wasn't assigned to the cleanup at first. Command kept me on standby patrol while salvage crews and medical teams moved through the wreckage field, cataloging, documenting, doing the slow, careful work that never makes it into the version of a story people actually want to hear. Nobody wants the 6 days after. They want the 2 hours during. But the 6 days after are where I learned the things that actually stayed with me. On the 4th day, Okafor pulled me off patrol and put me on the boarding team assigned to the Threshold flagship, or what remained of it. I asked her why me. Because you held position when I told you to, she said. And because I think you need to see this before you write your report. I didn't understand what she meant until I was standing inside that ship myself, boots on a deck plating built by hands that weren't human, in a corridor lit by amber light that felt warmer than I expected an invading warship's lighting to feel. The forward third of the ship was gone, the section that had vanished in that first silent strike, and the boarding team moved carefully around the exposed edge of it, a clean severed line where metal simply stopped. No jagged edges, no scorch marks, just an absence with a boundary. I stood at that boundary for a while before I made myself keep moving. The ship was quiet in the particular way of places that used to have people in them. We found the command deck first, empty, evacuated in the chaos before the ship went fully dark. Screens frozen mid-readout in a language none of our translation systems fully parsed yet, though the engineers working alongside us were already making progress, piecing together a grammar from context and repetition, the way you'd piece together any unfamiliar tongue. It was in a lower deck, in what turned out to be crew quarters, that I found the thing Okafor must have known I'd find, the thing she wanted me to see before I wrote anything down. A wall, in a small shared space that had clearly served as some kind of common room, covered edge to edge with drawings. Children's drawings, bright, uneven, the specific chaotic joy of art made by hands too young to worry about whether the proportions were right. Shapes that might have been family units, shapes that might have been pets, or something like pets. One drawing, near the center, showed 5 figures holding hands under a sky colored in careful, deliberate orange, the kind of orange a kid picks when they want the sky to look happy rather than accurate. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. Nobody on the boarding team said anything. Priya, standing beside me, reached up and touched the edge of one drawing, without quite touching the paper itself, the careful, reverent hover of someone who understands they're looking at something that doesn't belong to them, and never will. "They pin them up the same way we do," she said quietly. "Yeah, I don't know why that surprises me." Me neither. I thought about the form letter. Resource integration. Percentage deemed useful. I thought about how easy it would have been to let that language do the work of making this simple, to let myself believe that the crews on this ship had been nothing but the sum of the cruelty in their opening transmission. Standing in front of a wall of children's drawings pinned up in careful rows by parents who wanted their kids' art somewhere they'd see it every day, that easy version of the story stopped being available to me. I didn't tell my crew what I found down there, not in detail. I told Grant, later, over drinks neither of us finished, and he listened without saying much, the way he does when he knows the words aren't really for arguing with, just for setting down somewhere safe. "You think that changes anything?" he asked eventually. "What we did?" "No," I said. "I think it means we did the only thing that could have been done, and it still cost something. And pretending it didn't cost anything would be its own kind of lie." He nodded slowly, turning his glass in a small circle on the table between us. "My grandfather used to say something like that, about the wars. Said the worst thing you can do after winning is convince yourself winning was clean." Was it? For him? No, Grant said. He said nothing about it was ever clean. He just said clean wasn't the point. Surviving was the point. Making sure his kids got to grow up somewhere the ocean stayed blue was the point. I thought about my father again, about that photograph with the crack running through it that I still hadn't fixed, and about the particular kind of quiet he carried for his entire life, a quiet that I understood now, finally and completely, wasn't emptiness at all. It was restraint. It was the sound of someone who had seen exactly what happens when restraint runs out, and had spent the rest of his life making sure it never would again, in himself or in anyone he loved. The 40 surviving threshold ships were towed to a holding station on the far side of the belt, their crews given medical care, their wounded treated by the same doctors who would have treated any of ours, no distinction made in the treatment rooms between the species of the person on the table. I visited once, briefly, standing at the edge of a recovery ward full of beings I had no context for, watching human nurses move between beds with the same unhurried patience they'd show anyone. One of the threshold crew, an officer whose rank insignia our people were still working out how to translate, looked at me across the ward. I don't know what I expected to see in that look. Hatred, maybe. Fear. What I actually saw was something closer to confusion, the particular bewildered look of someone whose entire understanding of how the universe worked had been quietly, thoroughly dismantled in the space of 2 hours, and who hadn't yet had time to build anything to replace it with. I didn't say anything to them. I don't think there were words that would have crossed that gap yet. Not so soon. Not with so much still raw on both sides. I just held their gaze for a moment, and then I left, because staying any longer felt like it would have turned their pain into something for me to witness, rather than something that belonged to them. Command released an official statement 3 days after the engagement ended, brief and carefully worded, the kind of statement written by people who understood that the entire galaxy, whatever was left of it that had ever received one of those threshold form letters, would be listening closely to every word. Earth had not declared war. Earth had not celebrated a victory. Earth had, the statement said, defended itself, and would continue to defend itself, and extended medical care and eventual safe passage home to any survivor of the engagement who wished to return to their own people, carrying with them whatever account of what happened here they chose to carry. No triumph, no warning wrapped in threat, just a simple, unadorned fact, delivered the same way Okafor had delivered every order that day, calm, certain, and entirely without cruelty. I flew one more patrol before they finally stood me down for rest, out past the belt, past the drifting field of wreckage that recovery crews were still slowly, carefully clearing, past the holding station, where 40 ships full of frightened, confused survivors waited to learn what kind of world they'd actually landed in. I looked back at Earth from that distance, small and blue and quiet, exactly the way it always looked from up here, utterly unbothered by the fact that it had just, without a single visible weapon fired by human hands, ended the single largest invasion attempt any of us had ever heard of. I thought about the wall of children's drawings. I thought about my father's cracked photograph, still uncracked, still carried, still exactly as broken as it needed to be, to remind me why any of this mattered in the first place. We didn't win a war that day. I understood that now, sitting alone in the quiet of my cockpit, watching my home planet turn slow beneath me. Winning implies there was ever real doubt about the outcome, and there wasn't. Not once the Threshold Empire made the mistake of testing a species that had already fought its worst war against itself, and built something afterward, specifically so it would never have to fight one it might lose. We didn't win anything. We just remembered, all at once, exactly what we'd built, and exactly why, and exactly what it had cost the generation before mine to make sure it would be ready, waiting, patient, and terrible, and merciful, all at once, the next time something out there decided our quiet little corner of the galaxy looked easy. It wasn't easy. It was never going to be easy again.